The sea does not sleep, not even when the men upon its edges do, and in the far northern reaches of the Hebrides where the Atlantic breathes in long grey sighs against the stone, there stands a tower of light that keeps its vigil without rest or reward. The year is 1899, and the world beyond the waves is busily inventing itself anew. Cities crackle with telegraph lines, railways stretch like arteries, and the pulse of modernity hums beneath the cobblestones of London and Edinburgh. Yet out here, on the Flannan Isles, time drifts as slow as the mist. A single beam, sweeping through the infinite dark, marks the boundary between the known and the unknowable, and within its narrow walls dwells the keeper, whose name will never be written in books, for his life is meant to vanish into the rhythm of the sea. The lighthouse was completed only months ago, a triumph of engineering perched upon the unforgiving rock of Eilean Moor, and though it hums with the promise of progress, its great Fresnel lens gleaming like a jewel in the lantern room, its purpose remains ancient, to stand against oblivion, to hold a little flame against the devouring night. When the storms come, the tower shudders, but it endures, as all such structures must, anchored by duty and isolation, watched only by gulls and the wind. And so begins what the record would call an entirely routine day, though those who know the rhythm of solitude understand that there are no truly routine days when one lives alone among the elements. The morning begins not with sunlight but with a sound, the hollow moan of wind funneling down the stairwell, carrying with it the smell of salt and something older, metallic and damp, like the breath of the sea itself. The keeper stirs, not abruptly but slowly, as if rising were a habit learned from the tides. He lives by the clock, though time here is not so much measured as endured, a sequence of necessary motions, precise and unchanging. He lights the small stove, his hands moving with the steadiness of someone who has long ago stopped thinking about what they do. The kettle sings in its thin, reedy way, the tin cup warms, and the day begins with silence and tea. Outside, the wind combs the grass flat against the soil, the sky, low and heavy, presses itself upon the water until sea and cloud are indistinguishable. There is no horizon, only gradations of gray. Somewhere beyond the mist, ships crawl along invisible paths, trusting that the distant flash of this very tower will keep them from ruin. The keeper takes comfort in this thought, that his isolation has purpose, though the comfort is small and fleeting, like the warmth from his stove. He writes the weather in the logbook, wind WNW, force 5. Visibility poor. Barometer falling. The ink feathers slightly on the damp paper. He pauses to watch it spread, as though time itself were seeping outward from the letters. There is something devotional about the keeper's tasks, though he would never describe them so. Each motion, trimming the wick, polishing the brass, winding the clockwork, belongs to a ritual older than him, older even than this lighthouse. The lens itself, a vast eye of glass and brass, turns with a patient heartbeat, sending its measured pulse across the emptiness every 10 seconds. The keeper listens to the mechanism, hears in its soft clicks the rhythm that governs his world. Sometimes, when the foghorn calls, he feels it vibrate through the stone, a sound so low it seems to come from within his own chest. He has learned to live with that sound as one might live with a thought that never quite fades. There are 2 other men stationed on the island, assistant keepers, according to the log, but they are seldom seen except during the change of watch. Their routines overlap only briefly, like passing shadows. Solitude here is not an accident, it is the design. The service prefers its keepers quiet, steady, unremarkable. Men who can disappear into duty. He has become such a man. The day's maintenance begins with the lamp itself. Though it has burned through the night, it must now be cleaned, the soot wiped from the glass, the reservoir refilled with oil. He works with slow precision, aware that every movement carries weight in this place where errors echo for hours. The flame is extinguished, the room darkens, and for a moment the tower feels like a hollow instrument, waiting for sound. The smell of hot metal lingers. He polishes the reflectors until he can see his own reflection distorted across their curve, a dozen versions of his face, stretched and bent, gazing back at him from within the light's machinery. Sometimes, he thinks, the glass remembers what it has seen, storms, ships, the endless rotation of night and day. But these thoughts he keeps to himself, folded away like the scraps of paper he occasionally hides between the pages of the log, notes not meant for anyone, half-thoughts that begin and end with the sound of the sea. After the lens is tended, he descends the spiral stairs, 145 of them, each worn slightly by his own steps. The stairwell curves endlessly, like the inside of a seashell, and as he walks he can feel the air change from the cold of the lantern room to the damp warmth of the living quarters below. The walls sweat with condensation. The narrow windows let in light so thin it feels ghostly. In the kitchen, he prepares his breakfast, bread, slightly stale, and a sliver of salted meat. It is not the food that sustains him but the ritual of preparing it. Outside, the sea continues its slow violence against the rocks, and the gulls will and cry, their voices lost in the wind. The island is small, scarcely a quarter-mile across, and from the kitchen window he can see nearly all of it, the low stone path to the landing, the signal hut, the storage sheds. Beyond them, only the gray. He finishes his meal in silence, listening to the faint ticking of the clock mounted above the stove. It ticks like a heartbeat muffled by stone. There is always work to be done, though none of it ever changes. He inspects the oil drums, checks the rain gauge, notes the tide. He writes each detail in the log with the same steady hand. The entries from days past are indistinguishable from one another, endless repetitions of weather, visibility, wind direction. The sameness has a kind of gravity, pulling him deeper into stillness. Sometimes he imagines the mainland, the world of motion and voices, but the thought feels distant, unreal, like something he might have read once and forgotten. He cannot remember the last time he heard music. He cannot remember the last time he saw his own shadow under the full sun. Here, the light comes only from the lamp, and the lamp is not his but the sea's. When the supply ship comes, once every few weeks, it brings letters he does not open until nightfall, when the silence is complete and his mind has softened enough to let words sink through. The letters are always the same, a sister writing about weather and health, a superintendent noting small procedural corrections. They remind him that language is an act of distance, every word a bridge to somewhere else. He reads them slowly, then places them back in their envelopes, untouched by reply. By noon, the wind has shifted, and the sea has turned a deeper gray, streaked with whitecaps. He climbs again to the lantern room, inspecting the glass for cracks, the gears for rust. The motion of the lamp has a hypnotic quality, a slow and perfect inevitability. Standing beside it, he feels the world revolve, not around the sun but around this single, shining core. He wonders, not for the first time, what it would be like to live in a world without the mechanism, to watch the sea unlit, unmarked, purely itself. But then he remembers the ships, and the men who trust the light, and he knows that his thoughts are indulgent, even dangerous. Duty is a form of prayer here, and the lamp its altar. He bows to it slightly, though not intentionally, and the reflection of his movement shimmers across the glass like a ghost passing through. He thinks of the other keepers on other islands, all of them performing the same motions at the same hour, as though they are parts of a single mind dreaming itself across the sea. The thought comforts him, briefly, before dissolving into the quiet hum of the machinery. As the afternoon wanes, the light outside fades to silver. Mist gathers at the edges of the island, swallowing the horizon. He descends again to the living quarters, where he tends the small garden of herbs growing in tins, a rare indulgence, allowed only because he brought the seeds himself. The smell of mint and salt mingles in the air. He waters them with rain caught in a pail, careful not to spill a drop. The plants bend toward the dim light of the window, fragile but alive. He envies them, their small certainty, their uncomplicated reach toward the sun. Outside, the foghorn sounds again, deep and slow, echoing through the rock. It feels less like a warning and more like a heartbeat shared between the island and the sea. He listens until it fades. In the pause that follows, he thinks he hears something else, a faint rhythmic tapping, as though from inside the walls. It stops when he moves closer, begins again when he steps away. Perhaps the pipes, he thinks. Or the wind. The island is full of such sounds, half explained, never resolved. He does not write them in the log. Evening comes early here. By 4, the sky has darkened, and the lamp must be lit again. He climbs the stairs once more, the familiar ache in his knees, the lantern carried carefully before him. At the top, he prepares the flame, steadying it against the draft. The wick catches, glows, and the lens comes alive. The beam cuts through the fog like a blade of pure thought, reaching far into the distance where no eyes may see it. He watches it turn, slow and tireless. The mechanism hums. The tower breathes. In the silence between each rotation, he imagines he can hear the echo of its own light, a soundless pulse that touches the edge of the world and returns. It is a comfort and a haunting at once. He remains there for some time, listening to the sea and the faint groan of the gears. When he finally descends, night has claimed the island entirely. Only the beam remains, circling above like a watchful eye. Below, he sits by the stove, reading by the faint light of a lantern. The book is old, its pages swollen from damp, its words mostly forgotten tales of sailors and storms. He reads them not for meaning but for rhythm, the rise and fall of sentences like waves. Sometimes he imagines the stories changing as he reads them, their endings slipping into something unfamiliar. But he never checks. He lets the uncertainty remain, like the shifting of the tide. Outside, the wind grows stronger, rattling the shutters. The sea hurls itself against the rocks, relentless and unseen. He closes the book, listens. Somewhere in the distance, a bell sounds, faint, irregular, as though drifting through the fog. It could be the buoy, though it seems too near. He waits for it to fade, but it continues, slow and steady, until at last it merges with the rhythm of the wind and becomes indistinguishable. He makes a note in the log, fog dense. Foghorn active. Bell audible. Source uncertain. Later, as he lies in his bunk, the tower groaning softly around him, he feels the faintest tremor beneath the floorboards, as if something vast and unseen were moving far below, in the deep water. He knows it is only the sea, the ceaseless breathing of the world, but still he listens, eyes open to the dark. The light turns above him, each flash sliding across the walls, and in those brief illuminations the room seems to shift, the angles changing subtly, the shadows not quite returning to their places. He blinks, and it is still. The sea, the wind, the light, the trinity that governs his existence, continue without pause. It is an entirely routine night in an entirely routine day, and yet, somewhere within that sameness, something unspoken stirs, something that does not belong to any clock or logbook. The keeper drifts toward sleep, hearing the faint sound of the mechanism above, steady, eternal, and he dreams, as he always does, of the sea swallowing the light and returning it, again and again, until no difference remains between the two. Morning comes not with sunlight but with gray, diffused illumination that seeps rather than shines. The sea remains veiled, a vast and indistinct field of mist that rises and falls like breath. In the tower, the keeper wakes to the sound of water dripping from somewhere unseen, condensation gathering on the cold iron of the lantern room above, tracing invisible paths down through the stone. He does not startle, waking here is never sudden. It is a slow re-emergence into a world that never truly changes. The narrow window beside his bunk glows faintly, as though the fog itself had learned how to make light. He sits up, the wool blanket falling away, and listens to the familiar symphony of silence, the wind against the shutters, the faint ticking of the clock, the pulse of the lamp's mechanism above, muffled by distance. The air smells faintly of oil and metal and salt. There is no other scent in the world. He dresses in the same clothes as yesterday, thick wool, roughened by use, smelling faintly of smoke and brine. His boots are heavy, his movements deliberate. There is no hurry, because there is nowhere to go. The day is not something that begins, it simply continues. He lights the stove, strikes the match with slow precision, watches the flame bloom and catch. Fire feels ancient here, older than the sea itself. The kettle hisses, he pours water over the dark leaves in his cup. Steam curls upward, ghostly and ephemeral, vanishing before it touches the ceiling. Outside, the foghorn sounds, long and low, a voice older than any language. The sound vibrates through the stone, through the floor, through his chest. He feels it rather than hears it. It tells him what the world is: distance, emptiness, vigilance. He drinks his tea and watches the steam rise, thinking of nothing in particular. At 7, he writes in the logbook, the first duty of the day. Wind NNW, force 3. Visibility poor. Sea state moderate. Barometer steady. He writes in the same careful hand he has always used, each letter identical to those of the previous day, and the day before that. The book is not a record of change but of endurance. He thinks sometimes that if he were to write nothing changed across every page, it would still be the truth. Yet the service demands precision, and so he measures and records, his handwriting as mechanical as the lamp itself. The ink dries slowly in the damp air. He closes the book, wipes the nib clean, and returns it to its place beside the clock. There is comfort in the sequence of tasks. Routine is a kind of prayer, and here the hours are beads upon a rosary, each one turning smoothly into the next. After the log comes the inspection of the lamp. He climbs the spiral staircase, one hand trailing along the cold rail, counting the steps without meaning to. The tower is hollow, the sound of his boots echoing faintly. The air grows colder as he ascends, and thinner, filled with the faint metallic scent of machinery. When he reaches the lantern room, he pauses before opening the door. It is a small ritual, a moment of quiet, as if seeking permission to enter the heart of something sacred. The door creaks, the room breathes him in. Inside, the great lens gleams in the dim morning light, its facets catching and bending what little illumination there is. He wipes the glass with a linen cloth, careful not to leave streaks. The light, even extinguished, seems alive, a patient creature waiting for dusk. He inspects the oil reservoir, the clockwork, the vents. Everything is in order. The mechanism ticks softly, measuring time in increments smaller than thought. Outside, the fog presses against the glass like a living thing. For a moment, he can see nothing beyond it, only his own reflection, distorted and pale, suspended in the endless turning of the lens. It feels as though the tower itself were adrift, floating in cloud and memory. He descends again, pausing halfway to rest a hand against the wall. The stone is cool, damp, breathing faintly. The entire structure seems alive, as though the sea itself had poured its will into the mortar. He listens. There is the wind, the faint hum of the lamp, the distant cry of gulls. Beneath these sounds, deeper and slower, is something else, the low vibration of the ocean striking rock, a rhythm that seems almost like thought. He imagines, sometimes, that the island dreams, and that the lighthouse is the shape of that dream, rising toward the gray sky. At midday, the fog thins. For the first time in days, he can see the outline of the sea, vast, cold, indifferent. Waves move like muscle beneath the surface, their crests folding and dissolving. The light changes but never brightens. He steps outside, standing on the narrow path that winds from the door toward the landing below. The air is cold enough to bite, the wind carrying salt that gathers on his lips. He can see the signal hut, the storage shed, the faint outline of the crane used for lifting supplies. All of it looks smaller than he remembers, as though the island were shrinking by degrees. Beyond it, nothing. The horizon is a blur between sky and sea. He breathes deeply, tasting the iron of the wind. The other keepers are somewhere unseen, perhaps in the quarters, perhaps checking the fuel store. He does not call to them. Their silence is mutual, a kind of unspoken pact. Words, here, are precious and easily spent. When they do speak, it is in fragments of necessity, oil topped off. Pressure steady. Lens clear. No more is needed. In the evenings, they may share tea or a story, but even then, the conversation drifts like smoke, rising, fading. They are not unfriendly, only distant in the way that men become when surrounded by vastness. Isolation is not a punishment here, it is the condition of existence. He walks the perimeter of the island, a ritual he performs each day when the weather allows. The path is narrow, the rocks slick with moss. The sea crashes far below, white spray leaping upward to kiss the cliff's edge. He moves slowly, measuring each step, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The rhythm of his footsteps merges with the sound of the surf until they become indistinguishable. He thinks of the keepers who came before him, men whose names are written only in faded ledgers, whose faces have been forgotten by everyone except the sea. Some, he knows, never left their posts. They were buried here, their graves marked by simple stones that weathered down to anonymity. He passes one such stone now, its inscription gone, its surface slick with lichen. He touches it lightly, a gesture of respect or superstition, he is not sure which. By the time he returns to the tower, the wind has shifted again, carrying the scent of rain. He climbs once more to the lantern room to close the vents. The glass hums faintly, responding to the pressure of the coming storm. He glances at the clock, 2:30. The day folds into itself like a wave returning to the sea. He wipes the brass fittings once more, though they do not need it. There is a strange comfort in polishing something that will tarnish again tomorrow. In this place, impermanence is the only constant. The storm arrives quietly, as they often do. A subtle dimming of the light, a heaviness in the air. The first drops strike the glass, leaving trails that distort the view. The sea grows restless, waves climbing one another, their crests torn away by the wind. He watches from the window, the horizon erased. The tower vibrates faintly, a living thing under strain. Down below, the foghorn bellows, its sound absorbed almost immediately by the rain. He feels the vibration travel through the floor into his bones. The sea and the tower are speaking to one another, and he is caught between them, a listener with no language. Later, as the rain intensifies, he sits by the stove once more. The flame flickers, reflected in the dull metal of the kettle. The sound of the storm is constant, surrounding, like being inside a single, endless note. He feels neither fear nor unease. Storms are as routine as clear days, both are part of the order of things. Yet there is a moment, brief but undeniable, when the thunder rolls over the sea and he imagines that the sound is not thunder at all but something else, a vast, slow exhalation from beneath the water. He dismisses it, but the thought lingers. When evening comes, he prepares the lamp again. The storm has eased, but the air remains thick, the horizon still lost. The lens turns, its beam slicing through the mist, cutting the night into fragments. He stands beside it, watching the rotation, counting the seconds between flashes. 10 seconds exactly. The mechanism is flawless. He feels a quiet pride in its steadiness, as if the lamp's perfection might redeem his own imperfections. Outside, the sea answers each flash with a shiver of light across its surface. It is beautiful, in a way he no longer has words for. He writes again in the log, rain, heavy. Wind WSW, force 6. Visibility poor. Light operating normally. The handwriting is steady, unhurried. He underlines the last sentence, a habit, perhaps a superstition. The light operating normally means the world is still intact. He closes the book and places it beside the clock. Midnight feels both far away and imminent. In the tower, time folds upon itself, and each hour feels like the echo of another. He descends to his bunk once more, the air cool and damp. The walls glisten faintly in the lamplight. As he lies down, he can hear the faint creak of the structure, the whisper of water beneath the rocks. The light above continues its rotation, and in the intervals between flashes, the darkness feels thicker, more alive. He closes his eyes, and the hum of the mechanism fills his head, steady, rhythmic, eternal. The sea dreams outside, and the keeper dreams within it, both bound to their endless motion, both necessary to each other's meaning. And thus the first day ends as it began, entirely routine, entirely the same, and yet touched by something that cannot be named, only endured. Dawn comes like the slow lifting of a curtain that no one remembers drawing. The light is thin and undecided, filtered through the remnants of fog that cling to the sea like ghostly breath. The keeper wakes before the clock chimes 6, not because he must, but because the rhythm of his life has long since dissolved into the rhythm of the light. He lies still for a moment, listening. The rain has stopped, replaced by the quiet murmur of the tide receding among the rocks. Somewhere above, the great lens continues its slow revolution, finishing the long night's duty. The tower hums faintly with it, a body that never truly rests. He stretches, feeling the stiffness in his joints, the dull ache in his hands from years of work that demands precision but no creativity. It is a familiar ache, almost comforting in its constancy. He rises, dresses, and lights the stove. The smell of burning coal fills the small quarters, blending with the tang of salt that permeates everything. He makes his tea, tears a piece of bread, chews without tasting. Outside the window, the world is a pale monochrome, the sea like pewter, the sky a dull white that promises neither warmth nor clarity. He opens the logbook, writes the day's first entry. Wind ENE, force 2. Visibility moderate. Barometer rising. The ink spreads on the paper, forming letters as familiar as his own pulse. He has not seen handwriting other than his own in weeks. The realization passes through him like a ripple across still water, not painful, not pleasant, simply a fact of existence. After the entry, he begins his rounds. The pattern is eternal: descend, inspect the oil store, check the pumps, verify the fog signal. The small mechanical details of the lighthouse form a kind of language that he alone speaks. Each sound has its meaning: the whir of a wheel, the soft hiss of a valve, the occasional metallic cough of a gear in need of oil. He listens, interprets, adjusts. When he opens the door to the service room, the sudden brightness of the morning sea startles him. The storm has left its mark: seaweed plastered against the stones, gulls huddled in silence. The air is sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of kelp and iron. He inhales deeply, feeling the sting of salt in his lungs. For a moment, the world feels raw, newly made. He takes a moment to walk the path again, this time not from duty but from habit. The rocks glisten with rainwater, small rivulets run down toward the cliffs, vanishing into spray. He stops near the edge, where the sea hurls itself endlessly against the island's bones. The sound is immense, consuming. He watches the waves rise, fold, and break, an ancient choreography that needs no witness. In their rhythm, he senses something vast and impersonal, something that neither knows nor cares that he is there. He wonders if this is what the sea feels like about the light, an indifferent acceptance of its existence. The thought makes him smile faintly, though his face forgets how to hold the expression for long. Returning to the tower, he cleans the lantern room. The lens gleams, pristine, its facets catching and bending the morning light. He polishes the brass fittings, straightens the instruments, wipes away the thin film of salt that gathers overnight. Each motion is deliberate, unhurried, as though performed for an unseen audience. He checks the clockwork mechanism that drives the rotation, a series of gears, weights, and pulleys that must be wound by hand each day. The sound of it, the steady, ticking cadence, fills the silence like a metronome for thought. He winds it slowly, listening to the strain of the chain, feeling the resistance as the weight lifts. When he releases it, the mechanism resumes its motion, as steady as breath. He leans close to the glass and sees his reflection distorted across the curve of the lens, one face repeated 100 times, each one slightly warped, some thinner, some longer, all shimmering in the faint light. It feels, for a moment, as though he is surrounded by versions of himself suspended in the machinery of time. He blinks, and the illusion is gone. At midday, the sun attempts to pierce the cloud, its light diffused into a pale gold that softens the sea. The other keepers appear briefly, silent figures crossing the narrow yard, their oilskin coats glistening. They nod, exchange brief acknowledgments, vanish again into their respective duties. There is no conversation, but their presence is oddly reassuring, proof that he is not the last man in the world. He imagines that, to the passing ships beyond the horizon, they must seem like ghosts inhabiting a tower of light, unseen, unknown, but essential. He takes comfort in that thought, too. He prepares his midday meal, a tin of preserved meat, a few boiled potatoes, tea gone slightly bitter from overuse of the leaves. He eats standing by the window, watching the waves. The clouds drift low, their bellies dark and heavy, as if reluctant to release more rain. The horizon wavers. Somewhere beyond that line lies the mainland, invisible, intangible, a rumor of civilization. He tries to recall the last village he saw before coming here, the sound of voices, the smell of bread fresh from an oven. The memory is faint, blurred, as if it belonged to someone else. Time on the island does not move forward, it circles endlessly, a tide that erases its own footprints. In the afternoon, he inspects the supply stores. The oil drums stand in their neat rows, each marked with the date of delivery. He checks the levels, notes them carefully in the ledger. Everything is in order. Yet as he turns to leave, he feels a faint vibration beneath his boots, a tremor so subtle it could be imagined. He pauses, listens. The island is still. Only the wind moves. He shakes his head, attributing it to fatigue, and climbs back toward the light. But as he ascends, he feels again that subtle shiver through the stone, as though the island itself were exhaling. He pauses halfway, hand on the cold railing, and waits for it to pass. When it does, he resumes his climb, slower now, each step deliberate, measured. The light has dimmed by the time he reaches the lantern room. Clouds have thickened, and the horizon is swallowed once more. The air feels heavier, charged. He checks the instruments, the barometer has fallen slightly. Storm again, perhaps tonight. He prepares accordingly, securing the vents, inspecting the lantern's seals, ensuring the oil is full. His movements are calm, methodical, yet beneath them runs a subtle current of unease. The vibration in the stone lingers in his memory. He cannot quite forget it. Evening approaches. The sky lowers itself upon the sea like a closing lid. The light returns to its nightly duty, the first flash cutting through the gray with clean precision. The keeper stands beside it, watching the slow rotation. The beam sweeps across the mist, a blade of order carving through chaos. Each revolution feels like a heartbeat, slow and inevitable. He places his hand on the brass railing, feels the vibration of the mechanism beneath his palm. It is warm, alive. The lens turns, turns, turns. Outside, the sea answers with its own motion, endless, restless, unknowable. He remains there longer than usual, watching the rhythm continue. The world beyond the glass is a shifting void, yet the light insists upon its presence. It is a defiance both absurd and noble. He thinks of the men who built the tower, how they must have imagined it standing forever, immune to the sea's hunger. He wonders if any structure can truly resist the patience of water. In the end, everything dissolves, even stone. But not tonight. Tonight the light endures. Later, he descends to the quarters. The other keepers are already asleep, their breathing soft and even. He moves quietly, tending to small tasks, folding cloth, cleaning a mug, aligning the tools on the shelf. It is not compulsion but reverence. In a place where nothing changes, order becomes meaning. The clock ticks. The stove hums. He sits for a time, staring at the flame. The fire's light flickers across the walls, and for a moment he imagines that the shadows move independently of it, slow and deliberate, shifting as though guided by another source of light unseen. He blinks, and the illusion vanishes, leaving only the familiar dimness of the room. When he lies down, sleep does not come easily. The sound of the sea has changed, softer now, as if retreating. He listens, eyes closed, until another sound emerges beneath it, a faint, rhythmic tapping from somewhere deep within the tower. It is not the mechanism, he knows its every tone. This is slower, irregular. He counts the intervals, waits for the pattern to reveal itself, but it never does. The sound fades, returns, fades again. He considers rising, checking the source, but the fatigue in his limbs persuades him otherwise. Whatever it is, it will still be there in the morning, or it will not. He turns on his side, feeling the cool dampness of the sheet. The beam above sweeps through the window every 10 seconds, painting the room in alternating stripes of light and shadow. He begins to drift, thought dissolving into sensation, but just as he crosses the threshold of sleep, the tapping returns, closer now, or perhaps only louder. It sounds, for an instant, like the faint knocking of someone on a distant door. He opens his eyes to darkness. The beam sweeps across the wall once more, and for that brief moment of illumination, he thinks he sees, or dreams he sees, the outline of a handprint near the window, faint, blurred by condensation. He sits up, heart quiet but alert, listening. The sea breathes. The tower hums. Nothing else. He lies back down. It is nothing, he tells himself. The damp, the wind, the mind's small betrayals. The same as always. Outside, the light continues its endless rotation, unbothered by the mysteries it illuminates. The sea receives its glow, swallows it, and waits. And within the tower, the keeper closes his eyes, surrendering at last to the slow, tidal rhythm of sleep, where the difference between dream and duty fades entirely away. There is, in every keeper's day, a moment when the boundaries between self and sea blur completely, when the mind, long since disciplined by isolation, begins to think in tides and gusts, to measure time not by clocks but by the slow respiration of waves. Thomas Wren had come to that point without knowing it. Somewhere between his 5th and 6th month upon Bishop Rock, the rhythm of his existence had ceased to feel like endurance and instead resembled a form of prayer. It was not devotion in the religious sense, though he sometimes whispered fragments of the Psalms while trimming the wick. Rather, it was an obedience to pattern, a surrender to the quiet tyranny of maintenance. Every morning he woke before dawn, descended the spiral stair to record the barometer, noted the wind's direction, and stood for a moment in the doorway watching the horizon slowly gather itself from darkness. There were no surprises here. Even the storms arrived like familiar guests, roaring in the same dialect of wind and sea, rearranging the same stones at the base of the tower. Yet within that sameness, Thomas began to notice subtleties too fine for the untrained mind, the minute shifts in wave texture, the tonal differences of fog, the way light itself could hum when refracted through mist and salt spray. Silence had become his companion, heavy at first, oppressive even, but gradually revealing itself to be filled with hidden life. In the absence of conversation, the human ear learns to widen, to catch the nearly inaudible murmur of air moving through stone vents, or the faint hiss of vapor condensing on glass. Thomas had once read that monks in Carthusian monasteries could hear the flutter of a moth's wings across a chapel nave, and he understood now how that was possible. When a man is removed from the clamoring chorus of society, the smallest sound becomes an event, a visitation. Sometimes, while polishing the brass fittings near the gallery, he would hear the foghorn begin its moan from the mainland, carried across the miles like a voice calling through sleep. The sound reached him long after it had ceased there, an echo traveling across invisible corridors of mist and time. The logbook bore witness to this quiet ritual of perception. His entries had grown less technical and more reflective as the weeks passed. Clouds low, motionless, sea appears to breathe in long intervals, he had written one evening. Another, light exhibited without interruption, birds circling the lantern as if confused by their own reflections. The board would never read these notations for what they were, fragments of a meditation, attempts to record not merely meteorological conditions but the state of being that arose from witnessing them. He knew he should limit his language to barometric pressure and wind force, yet his hand rebelled, compelled to describe the world as he felt it rather than as the service demanded. There was comfort in this disobedience. It made him feel that the lighthouse itself conspired with him to preserve something human amid the mechanism. By mid-morning, he would have completed his inspection of the lamp room. The great Fresnel lens, made of concentric rings of ground glass, magnified every detail of his reflection as he leaned in to clean it. Each wrinkle, each flicker of concentration multiplied into 1,000 transparent ghosts. He sometimes imagined that one of those reflections might blink independently, slightly out of sync, a version of himself living in some adjacent layer of light. Such thoughts came more frequently now, as if the long exposure to repetition had thinned the boundary between observation and dream. Outside, the sea moved with its slow indifference. Gulls wheeled past the windows, their cries carried away before they reached his ears. Even the air seemed thick with distance. Around noon, Thomas would descend again to the living quarters and prepare his meal, salt pork, hard biscuit, and tea brewed strong enough to disguise the metallic taste of stored water. He ate mechanically, aware that the act was more about preserving discipline than satisfying hunger. There was a dignity in routine, a reassurance that one's purpose was intact even when unseen. The world beyond the island might change, governments, inventions, wars, but within these granite walls, existence held its steady temperature. He often thought of the engineers who had built Bishop Rock decades earlier, men who had lived and died so that this light might endure. Their names were carved in brass on a small plate near the entrance: Walker, Douglas, Stevenson. Each letter was filled with salt corrosion, as though the sea itself sought to erase memory even as it preserved the structure. It was during one of these solitary meals that Thomas noticed something peculiar. A faint vibration, too delicate to be the surf, trembled through the floor. At first, he assumed it was the machinery of the lamp above, but the pulse came from below, steady as a heartbeat. He paused, cup midway to his lips, and listened. The sound was neither metallic nor natural. It was like a muffled tapping, rhythmic, deliberate, coming from the direction of the rock itself. He waited, the air thick with the hush of concentration. After several seconds, the sound ceased, leaving behind only the ordinary murmur of wind against stone. He noted it in his log: unexplained vibration detected 12:43 p.m., duration approximately 20 seconds. Possible resonance from surf. Yet he knew it was not surf. He could distinguish the ocean's language as well as his own breath. That night, while trimming the wick for the second watch, he thought again of the vibration. Perhaps, he reasoned, it was a flaw in the foundation, a hollow chamber within the granite amplifying the tide. Still, he could not dismiss the impression that it had been a signal. The thought unsettled him, though not with fear, rather, it filled him with an eerie anticipation, as if something ancient and patient had stirred beneath the rock after a century of sleep. He lit the lamp and stepped back, watching the beam sweep across the void. Each rotation carved a corridor through the fog, illuminating fragments of sea that seemed to glisten like scales of some vast creature submerged in darkness. For the first time, the light no longer appeared purely benevolent. Its purpose, to warn, to guide, suddenly felt intrusive, almost sacrilegious, as though it trespassed upon secrets the sea preferred to keep veiled. In the hours that followed, the weather thickened into a gray blindness. Rain began to fall in slow, deliberate drops that struck the glass like quiet knocks. Thomas stood motionless, entranced by the rhythm. The human mind, deprived of company, begins to weave patterns from repetition. He found himself counting the drops between each rotation of the beam, synchronizing his breathing with the mechanical pulse. The light revolved once every 30 seconds, the rain struck 20 times within that interval. Together they formed a kind of music, monotonous yet soothing, a lullaby for the sleepless. The sea answered with its own bass line, the slow surge of water against rock, and above it all, the faint wheeze of the wind through the lantern's ventilators. It was as if the entire world had become an enormous clockwork, each element turning in perfect, mournful harmony. He slept briefly, waking to the pale shimmer of dawn filtering through fog. His dreams had been filled with indistinct images, the reflection of the lens spiraling infinitely, a stair descending into water, a hand tapping from beneath stone. The details dissolved as he rose, replaced by the calm necessity of duty. There was a comfort in the mechanical gestures of mourning, the winding of the weight mechanism, the cleaning of soot, the careful record of temperature. Each task reaffirmed his existence, tethered him to the tangible world. Yet even as he moved through the motions, he felt a faint displacement, as though he were performing the duties of another man who had once lived here and whose life he now inhabited. The walls, slick with condensation, seemed to whisper this suggestion, their stones breathing faintly as if remembering the hands that had built them. Later that day, as he stood at the gallery surveying the horizon, he caught sight of a distant shape moving across the water. It was a vessel, small, likely a fishing sloop, its sails ghostly white against the dark sea. He raised his telescope, focusing on the figure at the helm. For a moment, the image wavered, then resolved into clarity, a solitary man, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. The boat moved slowly, almost aimlessly, as though following an unseen current. Thomas watched for several minutes until the fog swallowed it whole. When he lowered the glass, the sensation of being observed remained, inexplicable but undeniable. He closed the log for the day and descended the stair, the air around him dense with unspoken meaning. As night fell, he lit the lamp once more. The vibration did not return, nor did the mysterious vessel. Yet he sensed that something had shifted in the quiet order of his world. The sea, which had always seemed indifferent, now appeared to be listening. And he, the keeper of light, found himself listening in return, not to the wind or the waves, but to the silence beneath them, vast and articulate, as though the ocean itself were preparing to speak. By the second night after the strange vibration, Thomas Wren found that silence no longer felt like absence but like pressure. It pressed inward from the walls, gathered in the stairwell, and condensed in the corners like invisible mist. He moved through it carefully, unwilling to disturb it too suddenly, as one might move through a sleeping house. There were moments when even his heartbeat seemed impertinent, too loud in the great, echoing solitude of the tower. When he lit the wick, the faint pop of flame startled him. The light expanded slowly, finding its way through the lenses, bending across the curvature of glass, until the beam unfurled once more into the night. It revolved with its usual calm authority, one complete rotation every 30 seconds, constant and eternal, but now he could not escape the feeling that the light was searching rather than warning, that it was not meant merely to guide passing ships, but to find something, or someone, lost in the darkness. He stood watching the beam until its rhythm began to blur. The light's passage across the mist looked like breathing, inhale, exhale, each revolution an act of continuation. His eyes, fixed upon the slow dance of brightness and shadow, began to water from the strain, yet he could not look away. There was a hypnotic pull in that steady rotation, a cadence that seemed older than the mechanism itself. When at last he turned, his shadow lagged slightly behind, as though the light and darkness were no longer perfectly synchronized. For a fleeting instant, he wondered whether time itself turned differently within these stone walls. Below, the wind had risen. It crept through the smallest seams of the tower, producing a thin, keening hum that varied with each gust. Thomas had come to recognize the different voices of the wind, some hollow and mournful, others sharp and almost jubilant, but tonight's sound was unlike any he had heard. It seemed deliberate, a high note sustained too long, as if someone were drawing a bow across the lip of a glass. He leaned close to the slit window, pressing his ear to the cold iron frame. The sound trembled through the metal, pure and steady. Somewhere beyond the fog, he imagined, the air itself was singing. He recorded the phenomenon in the log, wind at ESE, peculiar tone like glass under tension. But he hesitated before moving to the next line. The entry looked inadequate, bloodless. How could one translate into numbers or compass points the deep unease such sounds provoked? He closed the book and stood for a while, listening. The vibration he had heard days before did not return, but the singing persisted, sometimes near, sometimes far, weaving through the rhythm of the sea like a memory half remembered. At dawn, the fog lifted enough to reveal the jagged sweep of the horizon. The sea was calm, unnaturally so, like a vast sheet of breathing glass. Thomas brewed his tea and carried it up to the gallery, where the morning sun had begun to color the mist a muted gold. The world below him looked newly made, stripped of motion and history. He thought of the men who had tended this light before him, each confined within the same walls, each staring out at this same indifferent expanse. Their names, recorded in faded ledgers, meant little now. The sea did not remember them. It received their vigilance and returned nothing, not gratitude, not even acknowledgement. And yet the light still turned, unwavering. He began to sense that perhaps this was the true purpose of the keeper's existence, to maintain not merely a lamp, but a conversation with silence itself. To listen so deeply that one began to hear what silence contained. In this way, the job was not unlike that of a priest, though the altar was a lens and the congregation, unseen. Each night he ascended the spiral stair as if approaching a sanctuary, carrying his lantern like an offering. The smell of oil, the hiss of the flame, the gentle rotation of the machinery, all of it merged into a ritual older than his own comprehension. On the fourth day, a storm approached. He could feel it long before it arrived, in the sudden heaviness of air, in the faint electric sting that clung to the skin. The sea darkened first, then the sky, until both seemed to conspire in shadow. By afternoon the first squall struck, a wall of rain so thick it blurred the horizon into oblivion. Thunder rolled beneath the waves, deep and resonant, as though the ocean itself had begun to speak in subterranean tones. Thomas worked swiftly, securing shutters, checking the lamp's clockwork, ensuring that every flame was fed. The tower shuddered as the wind hit full force. Spray reached the windows, salt crystallizing almost instantly on the glass. For hours he labored in the mechanical glow, surrounded by the ceaseless percussion of storm. It was not fear he felt, but a strange exhilaration, the same peculiar clarity that sometimes comes to soldiers in battle or monks in ecstatic prayer. The violence outside made his own heartbeat seem trivial, and in that triviality, he found freedom. When lightning illuminated the gallery, he glimpsed for a fraction of a second what looked like faces in the glass, reflections perhaps, or tricks of light, half-seen profiles staring back at him from impossible angles. They vanished as quickly as they appeared, leaving only the empty curvature of the lens. He touched the cold metal rim, steadying himself. The storm lasted through the night and into morning. By the time it passed, the world seemed newly washed, the sea gleaming with exhausted calm. Thomas descended to inspect the foundation for damage. There were fresh cracks in the mortar, salt lodged deep in the joints, but the structure remained sound. He noted the details in his report, though his hand trembled slightly as he wrote. Perhaps it was fatigue, or perhaps the memory of those fleeting reflections. He did not mention them, unwilling to see such words in official ink. The service did not approve of imagination. That evening, when he climbed again to light the lamp, he found the air heavy and still, as though the storm had taken all movement with it. The mechanism ticked faintly in the silence, an artificial heartbeat. He turned the crank, felt the weight descend through its hidden shaft, and listened to the gears settle into their rhythm. When the beam ignited, the light felt different, denser, almost material. It poured out not as illumination but as substance, like a slow exhalation of memory. He stood very close to the lens, close enough that his breath fogged its surface, and for a moment he thought he saw a faint glow within the fog itself, an echo of light trapped in vapor. Then came the sound again, the tapping, faint and deliberate, from below. This time it was unmistakable. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. The pattern repeated twice before fading into silence. Thomas froze, every sense sharpened. The sound had come from deep within the base of the tower, perhaps from the contact between rock and stone. He descended the stairs, lantern in hand, the light trembling with each step. At the lowest level, where the storage rooms met the foundation, the air was colder than it should have been. He held the flame close to the wall, searching for cracks or loose stones. Nothing. The tapping had ceased entirely. He stood there for several minutes, listening to his own breathing. The silence felt alive, alert. Somewhere in that darkness, something seemed to wait, not malevolent, but expectant, like a thought unspoken. He whispered aloud, though he did not know why, "Who's there?" The sound of his voice startled him. It seemed foreign, unfamiliar, as though it belonged to the tower rather than to him. No answer came. Only the faint drip of condensation falling from the ceiling. He turned, intending to leave, but before he reached the stair, he heard a single sound behind him, a soft exhalation, almost like a sigh. When he spun around, the lantern's light revealed nothing but stone. Back in his quarters, he wrote again in the log, this time more hesitantly, unidentified sound from base. Possible resonance following storm. Will observe further. He stared at the words for a long while, knowing they concealed more than they revealed. There were rules, both official and unspoken, about what a keeper could admit. Madness was a word often whispered among the isolated, and once written, it could end a man's service. So he closed the book and sat by the small window, watching the horizon dissolve into twilight. Days passed. The tapping did not return, nor did any ship appear on the horizon. But each night, as he tended the light, Thomas sensed the presence of something unseen, something vast and patient, coiled within the quiet depths of the sea. The isolation that once comforted him now felt charged with meaning, as though every gust of wind, every flicker of reflection carried a message he was meant to decipher. Yet even as unease grew, he continued his duties with unwavering precision. The light must never fail. It was the one immutable law in a world otherwise surrendering to ambiguity. And so, through the steady turning of days, Thomas Wren came to understand that silence itself was not the absence of sound but the accumulation of all things unsaid. It was the echo of every keeper who had stood where he stood, each listening to the same wind, each wondering if the sea remembered their names. As he gazed into the endless dark, the beam revolving endlessly, he began to suspect that perhaps it did. Not with affection, not with malice, but with the deep, indifferent intelligence of something that endures all names and all lights. Morning came without ceremony, as though it had been there all along, waiting behind the fog until the light decided to fade. Thomas Wren had not truly slept, rather, he had drifted in and out of a waking trance, lulled by the soft creaks of the tower and the whispering sea. The dream, if it could be called one, left no clear image, only a lingering impression of movement below the waterline, something gliding through the depths with a patience beyond time. When his eyes opened, it was to a half-light that seemed neither dawn nor dusk, a pale suspension that erased distinction between hours. He dressed in silence, wound the clockwork, and recorded the morning temperature. Sea calm. Visibility moderate. No vessels sighted. The words fell into the page like stones into a well, vanishing into depth, leaving no echo. He carried his tea up to the gallery and stood by the great lens. The glass still bore faint traces of salt from the storm, crystalline veins that caught the new sunlight and refracted it into subtle rainbows. As he cleaned them, he caught sight of his reflection again, multiplied 1,000-fold, each version of himself leaning inward with identical concentration. But one of them, just for an instant, appeared delayed. A trick of light, perhaps, or fatigue. Yet the unease remained, soft but persistent, like a splinter beneath skin. The sea below was a mirror, astonishingly smooth. Even the gulls seemed to hesitate before crossing its surface, their wings brushing against their own reflections. The horizon, where sky and water should have met, had dissolved entirely into a silver haze. It was as if the world had been simplified to two elements, light and silence, and he alone remained to witness their fragile balance. There was beauty in it, yes, but also something faintly unbearable. For the first time since his appointment, Thomas felt the full weight of the light's isolation, not as confinement, but as exposure. The tower stood naked before infinity, a solitary eye gazing into a face that did not gaze back. Later, while inspecting the oil stores, he noticed a faint tremor underfoot, subtle enough that he might have imagined it. The barrels rattled softly, then settled. He waited for a second pulse, but none came. Still, he felt the urge to descend again to the foundation. The memory of the tapping lingered, unresolved. Lantern in hand, he made his way down the spiral stair, each step echoing softly in the narrow shaft. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, until it carried the faint mineral scent of wet stone. At the base, the passage opened into the small storage room, its walls glistening with condensation. The faint drip from above continued, rhythmic, steady. He crouched and pressed his ear to the floor. Nothing. only the slow throb of his own blood. He was about to rise when he noticed something new, a thin line of moisture running across the stone, perfectly straight, glimmering faintly in the lantern's light. It was not a leak, for the mortar above it was dry. The line traced a narrow path from one wall to another, as though marking a seam between worlds. He touched it with a fingertip. The water was cold, unnaturally so. For a moment, he thought he felt the faintest pulse within it, like breath drawn through a reed. Then it was gone. He withdrew his hand, wiped it on his trousers, and ascended quickly, his footsteps louder than he intended. That evening, the sky turned the color of tarnished silver. No wind, no rain, only a stillness so complete that even the sea seemed to hesitate between movements. Thomas lit the lamp, wound the mechanism, and stood beside the lens as the first sweep of light pierced the mist. Each rotation struck the haze and reflected faintly back, illuminating the tower in dim halos. The air inside the lantern room shimmered with tiny motes, dust, salt, and something else, almost luminous. He breathed it in without realizing, and for a moment felt dizzy, as though the light itself had entered his lungs. The sensation passed quickly, leaving behind a heightened clarity. Every sound seemed sharper, the whisper of the gear teeth, the faint hiss of oil, the slow rotation of the world. He leaned closer to the lens, drawn by some quiet compulsion. The reflections multiplied endlessly, overlapping until they ceased to resemble faces at all. Instead, he saw patterns of light forming and dissolving, circles within circles, like ripples spreading through unseen depths. And in the center, faint but undeniable, a shape moved. It was not human, nor entirely alien, but something that evoked both, a presence defined more by rhythm than by form, an undulation of brightness that seemed to echo the sea's breathing. He blinked, and it vanished. Only his own reflection stared back, calm and pale. He stepped away, heart steady but mind unsettled. It was not fear he felt, but recognition. The sea had been speaking all along, through vibration, through reflection, through the slow weaving of silence. The light was merely the instrument by which its voice became visible. The thought filled him with a kind of reverence. Perhaps every keeper before him had glimpsed it in some form, a subtle alignment between the mechanical and the eternal. Perhaps that was what drove them to stay, year after year, alone at the edge of the world. He descended, meaning to eat, but hunger did not come. Instead, he sat by the narrow window and watched the horizon fade into darkness. The beam swept across the sea, carving the same measured arc. Once every 30 seconds, it touched the mist and vanished, leaving afterimages in his eyes. The rhythm was absolute. Yet tonight, between two rotations, he thought he saw something interrupt its passage, a darker shape, faint and low, drifting across the water. A vessel, perhaps, though no lights marked it. He fetched his telescope and peered through the glass. The shape resolved slowly into focus, a small boat, open-decked, with a single figure seated motionless at the stern. The man, or what appeared to be a man, wore a coat that hung heavy with moisture. His head was bowed, his hands folded in his lap. The beam swept past him, and for an instant, the light revealed a face pale as wax, eyes closed, expression serene. Then the fog swallowed him again. Thomas waited for the beam to return, but when it did, the boat was gone. He lowered the glass and rubbed his eyes. The surface of the water was empty, smooth as metal. No trace of wake, no ripple of departure. He considered signaling, but with what? There was no sound but the slow grinding of the machinery above. He made an entry in the log, unidentified vessel sighted 2214. Disappeared without trace. He hesitated, then underlined the last phrase. The ink spread slightly on the damp page, as though the words themselves were sinking. Sleep came fitfully. The sound of the sea filled his dreams, steady, low, endless. He dreamed of the foundation room again, but this time the walls were translucent, and beyond them the ocean glimmered with slow, undulating light. Shapes moved in that radiance, vast and graceful, circling the base of the tower as though drawn by its pulse. One of them rose toward him, its outline shifting between human and not. When it reached the wall, it did not break against it but merged, passing through stone like water through cloth. A hand, pale, fluid, reached upward toward him, and from it came a sound, not speech, but a deep vibration that he felt more than heard. It resonated through his bones, through the tower, through the very air. And then he awoke, drenched in sweat, though the air was cold. He rose and climbed the stair, needing to see the light. The mechanism ticked with serene indifference. The beam continued its rotation, flawless, eternal. Outside, the sea shimmered faintly under moonlight, each wave crest reflecting like a fragment of glass. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet as he stood there, his hands resting on the brass rail, a faint sound rose from below, not tapping, not sighing, but humming, steady and low. It was the same note he had heard within his dream, vibrating gently through the stone. He felt no fear now, only the sense of something inevitable unfolding. The tower had always been a bridge between worlds, the human and the elemental, the temporal and the eternal. Perhaps the sea, after decades of listening to the turning of light, had finally chosen to answer. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the vibration travel through him, aligning heartbeat and breath with its rhythm. For a moment, he thought he could distinguish words within it, not in English or any tongue he knew, but in a cadence that felt profoundly intimate. When he opened his eyes again, dawn was approaching. The light, obedient as ever, continued its rotation. The sea lay quiet, unbroken. He wrote in his log, heard vibration consistent with harmonic resonance of foundation. Duration indefinite. Then, below that, in smaller letters, it understands. He closed the book, the pen trembling faintly between his fingers, and sat watching the horizon until the first color of morning bled into the mist. The following days unfolded in a strange and gentle symmetry. Each morning Thomas would wake to the same pale light, record the same silent readings, and gaze upon the same horizon that seemed both close enough to touch and infinitely distant. Yet beneath the sameness, something had changed. The air carried a different weight. The sound of the waves, once random, fragmented, had begun to take on a curious rhythm, a slow pattern that almost seemed deliberate, as though the sea were learning the syntax of speech. Even the light behaved differently. Its beam, when cutting through the mist, would linger an instant longer on certain portions of the water, illuminating invisible shapes that dissolved as quickly as they formed. He began to sense intention in these small deviations, a conversation taking place just beyond the threshold of human comprehension. He wrote more frequently in the logbook now, though his entries grew less formal, more meditative. "The sea is not empty," he wrote one evening. "It is a mind without form, a memory without language. We are its temporary listeners." The words seemed excessive at first, too poetic for a keeper's duty. Yet each time he read them again, they felt less like invention and more like transcription, something that had already been said elsewhere and was merely repeating itself through him. The line between observation and revelation had thinned to transparency. At night, he began to notice the phosphorescence more vividly than before. The plankton blooms near the base of the tower had grown dense, their glow pulsing faintly in response to the turning of the light. He would stand by the narrow window for hours, watching as those slow, radiant rhythms synchronized with the lamp's mechanical sweep. The two systems, the living and the constructed, seemed to recognize each other, to find harmony in repetition. It was a communion of pulse and pattern. Once, when the beam crossed the water, the glowing tide seemed to rise in response, as if bowing to its reflection. It was during one such night that he saw the figure again. Not the one in the boat, but another, standing this time upon the rocks at the base of the island. The light swept over it for a heartbeat, revealing a tall, motionless silhouette. The posture was unmistakably human, though its edges shimmered faintly, as if the mist itself were taking shape. Thomas froze, his breath held in the cold air. The beam turned away, darkness reclaimed the rocks, and when it returned, the figure was gone. Only the faint phosphorescent trail of disturbed water remained. He descended the stairs slowly, compelled by something deeper than curiosity. Outside, the air was thick with salt and moisture. The stones glistened beneath his lantern. The path wound down to the shore, where the tide murmured against the rocks in a rhythm that seemed to echo his own pulse. He scanned the darkness, but saw nothing beyond the shifting fog. Then, faintly, a sound. Not the low hum he had grown used to, but a voice, soft and distant, as though carried upward through water. He could not make out the words, yet their cadence felt familiar. The voice seemed neither male nor female, neither human nor alien, but some mingling of the two, a tone both ancient and sorrowful. It spoke, paused, and spoke again, and in each syllable he sensed recognition, like hearing one's own name whispered from a dream. The temptation to answer was overwhelming. He opened his mouth, and the wind, if it could be called that, rose suddenly, scattering droplets of mist that glittered like dust motes in the lamplight. When he spoke, his own voice sounded foreign, drawn out, flattened by the sea's echo. "Who are you?" The question dissolved into the air, unanswered, yet the silence that followed felt alive, sentient. A tremor moved through the rocks beneath his feet, subtle but deliberate, as if acknowledging receipt of the message. Then all fell still again. He stood there until the cold began to seep into his bones. When he finally turned back toward the tower, the light above revolved in its perfect cycle, unwavering, eternal. Yet as he ascended, he noticed something odd. The clockwork's tick, usually precise, had begun to drift, so slightly that only a keeper's ear could detect it. The intervals between each turn of the gear had stretched by mere fractions of a second, but enough to unsettle his sense of order. He opened the mechanism's casing and checked the governor wheel. Nothing appeared broken or misaligned. The lamp continued to burn cleanly, its flame steady. Still, the rhythm felt different, less mechanical, more organic, as though the light had begun to breathe. He thought again of the phosphorescent tide, of how it pulsed in time with the lamp's rotation. Could the light have been drawn into their rhythm instead of the other way around? The notion was absurd, yet it lingered. Machines, after all, were only extensions of human will, human perception externalized. But what if the external world, patient and ancient, could shape that rhythm in return? What if the sea had been slowly reconfiguring the mechanism to match its own pulse? The idea was at once terrifying and beautiful, the fusion of two systems, man's machine and nature's organism, into a single harmonic continuum. Days passed without incident, though each one felt increasingly detached from the last. The fog grew denser, blurring boundaries between sky and sea until even the horizon seemed erased. Thomas's reflections multiplied across the lens like specters, each one slightly delayed, each moving with an independence that unsettled him. He began to notice, during certain hours, that the mirror nearest the central lens no longer reflected his movements precisely. It would blink when he did not, tilt its head a second after he turned away, or stare a moment longer into the void. He tested it once by lifting his hand in a deliberate gesture. The reflection did not move. Instead, it regarded him with a faint, almost sympathetic expression, as though trying to convey something wordless. Then, slowly, it raised its own hand, not to mimic him, but to beckon. He stumbled back, heart hammering. The reflection dissolved into a blur of light, leaving only the familiar machinery behind. But the gesture had been unmistakable, a summons, or perhaps an invitation. He sat on the floor for a long while afterward, listening to the faint hum that had now become constant within the stone. It was no longer intermittent. The entire tower seemed to vibrate subtly, as though some immense force deep beneath the waterline were resonating upward through its foundation. The sound was not unpleasant, it carried a tonal harmony, low and continuous, like the world's most distant choir. When sleep finally came, it brought visions rather than rest. He dreamed of the sea as a vast, breathing creature, its waves the rise and fall of a chest, its depths the slow turning of thought. In its heart lay a light, not the manufactured brilliance of the lamp above, but a soft, internal radiance, ancient and organic. From that center, tendrils of brightness reached outward, touching the roots of the tower, threading themselves through stone and metal and finally into him. The light did not blind, it revealed. In its glow, he saw that every grain of sand, every droplet of water, every rotation of gear and hand and clock were variations of the same pattern, a single consciousness perceiving itself in infinite forms. When he awoke, tears were on his face, though he could not say why. The next morning, he found the logbook open on his desk. He did not remember leaving it so. On the page, written in ink identical to his own, were 3 words, "We remember you." The handwriting was not quite his, though close enough to unsettle him. Each letter trembled faintly, as though written by a hand unaccustomed to solidity. The words glistened wetly, though the ink bottle beside the book was sealed. He ran his fingers lightly across the text. It did not smudge. It felt as though the words had been absorbed directly into the fibers of the paper, as if grown there rather than written. He sat motionless for a long time, the phrase echoing within him. "We remember you." Not I, but we. The plural implied a collective presence, a memory older than his own, reaching back through generations of lightkeepers, perhaps beyond even them. Could the sea itself remember? Could water hold the imprint of all it had touched, retaining the memory of every life that had ever reflected upon its surface? He thought of the countless keepers before him, each staring into that same horizon, each listening to that same rhythm of waves. Perhaps their consciousnesses had not vanished at death but been absorbed into the ocean's dreaming. By nightfall, his resolve had shifted. The fear that had once lingered around these events had softened into an almost sacred curiosity. He prepared the lamp as usual but left the clockwork unlatched, allowing the rotation to slow. The beam moved languidly now, its arc stretching into a continuous caress of light across the sea. The phosphorescence below responded at once, rising into brilliant undulations that spread outward like ripples from a single heartbeat. The hum deepened, resonating through his chest, and in its sound he detected harmony, complex, evolving, purposeful. He spoke aloud then, his voice trembling but sincere. "If you remember me, then tell me what I am remembering." The words drifted outward, carried on mist and salt. For a long time, there was no answer. Then the sea itself seemed to inhale. The phosphorescent glow brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again, each pulse synchronized with the tower's faint vibration. A rhythm emerged, long, short, short, long, an unmistakable pattern. Morse. He raced to his desk, scribbling down each sequence, translating by instinct. When the final pulse faded, the message read, "You are the light that watches itself." He read it again and again, feeling its weight. It was not metaphor but revelation, the understanding that consciousness, in its purest form, was reflection. The sea watched him as he watched it. The light illuminated the world, but also itself, caught endlessly between object and observer. The tower was not merely a structure of stone and brass, it was an instrument through which awareness passed back and forth, oscillating between human and elemental realms. When dawn broke, he stood at the window, the first sunlight dissolving the fog. The world outside looked unchanged, quiet sea, slow waves, horizon clear. Yet everything within him had shifted. He no longer felt alone. The hum had quieted, though he sensed it still, deep beneath the calm surface. He knew now that the mirror of the sea did not reflect, it remembered. And in that remembrance, he too would remain, long after the lamp was extinguished and the tower surrendered to the tide. There are moments in time, Thomas would later write in the margins of an unfinished log entry, when the boundary between progress and memory begins to dissolve. The 19th century, for all its machines and marvels, for all its telegraphs, microscopes, and compasses, had always prided itself on the conquest of mystery. Yet here, on the edge of the known world, among waves and vapor, there seemed no victory, only negotiation. The sea remained inviolate. And perhaps, he thought, the lighthouse itself, this proud tower of rational light, was never meant to conquer darkness, but merely to converse with it. Each beam was an act of translation, not dominion. That morning arrived with a strange, amber hue in the air. The mist had withdrawn just far enough to reveal the horizon, which shimmered as though behind glass. The gulls that circled the tower had grown quiet. Even the waves seemed subdued, their motion slower, heavier, as if the entire sea were a lung inhaling too deeply to exhale. Thomas felt it immediately, an unease that was not fear but anticipation, as though something vast and invisible were aligning itself into pattern. He attended to his duties mechanically, trimmed the wick, polished the lens, wound the clockwork. But each gesture felt rehearsed, like performing a rite rather than fulfilling a task. He realized, with quiet astonishment, that the motions of his work, so ordinary, so mundane, had taken on a sacred rhythm. In the old manuals of lighthouse keeping, printed by the Trinity House and distributed to every station from Cornwall to the Hebrides, there were entire pages dedicated to precision. The turning of the lamp, the cleaning of the prism, the maintenance of oil and balance, all were written as commandments of order. And yet Thomas now saw them differently. The repetition of labor, the cyclical inspection, the recording of the sea's temperament at each hour, these were not mere protocols of empire. They were incantations. The modern age, in its haste to measure the world, had unknowingly preserved the oldest ritual of all, the attempt to keep the unknown illuminated by rhythm. He recalled how the ancients, too, had understood light not as energy but as breath. The Greeks spoke of phos as the soul's outward gaze, the Celts believed flame to be the boundary between spirit and world. Even in early Christian seafaring orders, the keeping of lamps had been described as an act of devotion, an offering of vigilance to the divine. The lighthouse, though constructed in the language of engineering, was still haunted by the vocabulary of the temple. Every lens was a prayer. Every turning beam, a reminder that the boundary between science and sacrament was thinner than modernity liked to admit. In the stillness of that morning, Thomas understood what the sea had begun to teach him, that progress was merely the rephrasing of ancient truths. Humanity had replaced myth with mechanism, yet both spoke to the same hunger, to preserve light against the encroaching dark. The difference lay only in the vocabulary. And perhaps, he thought, in its arrogance, the modern world had forgotten to listen to what it once tried to measure. He sat at the desk, the open log before him, and began to write, not the usual readings or barometric notes, but something deeper, something that bordered on confession. There is a pulse beneath all structure, he wrote, a rhythm that precedes invention. Every machine hums because it echoes the breath that made it. He paused, his pen hovering above the page, aware of the quiet ticking around him, the faint metronome of the clockwork above, the drip of condensation along the wall, the distant beat of waves. Together they formed a pattern that felt alive. If this is the age of light, he continued, then it is also the age of memory, for light itself remembers what it touches. As the ink dried, a faint tremor passed through the floor, subtle but perceptible. The vibration seemed to rise through the desk into his hand. He looked up. The lantern room above emitted a faint hum, not unlike the one he had felt days before, but now steady, resonant. It was as if the entire mechanism had begun to sing softly to itself. He ascended the spiral staircase, each step ringing like the low note of a bell. When he reached the gallery, the world outside was awash in diffused light. The fog had returned, but it shimmered faintly, almost iridescent, like the inside of a shell. He approached the lens. Its vast, concentric surfaces caught the muted sun and refracted it into delicate patterns that drifted across the walls. The air smelled faintly of oil and ozone. For a moment, he could swear that within the light itself were shapes, faint, fluid geometries moving slowly, like the pulse of something immense and patient. He remembered the phrase from the logbook, "You are the light that watches itself." What if the lamp was no longer merely a beacon, but a mirror, one that had begun to turn its awareness inward? It was absurd, of course, but as he stood before it, he felt that same gentle recognition that had accompanied his dreams. The light pulsed once, a fraction brighter, and in that instant he saw within its heart the faint outline of a face. It was not clear or human, only the suggestion of features formed by motion and glow. A second later it was gone, leaving him trembling and serene. He descended to the service room and retrieved the old maintenance journal, a thick volume bound in cracked leather, filled with the handwriting of previous keepers. He had read parts of it before, mostly notes on machinery or weather anomalies. But now he turned to the older pages, those written in the early years of the Lighthouse's operation, decades before his posting. There, beneath neat accounts of storms and supply deliveries, were entries of a different nature. The light spoke in the wind, one keeper had written in 1832. It hummed as though alive. Another had noted, cryptically, the sea and the lamp are one and the same, each the reflection of the other. And farther still, dated 1809, it has begun again. The rhythm beneath the waves. He felt a chill move through him. These men had experienced what he now felt, though they had not named it. Perhaps they too had glimpsed that hidden continuum, the thread binding light, time, and mind. And if so, perhaps this was not madness, but inheritance. The keepers were not simply caretakers of machinery, they were stewards of an ancient correspondence between the world's inner and outer light. Outside, the wind began to rise, though it carried no storm. The fog thickened, swirling in slow spirals, as though following some invisible geometry. Thomas stepped out onto the balcony and felt the moisture bead upon his face. The sea below was utterly still, a mirror of gray glass. In that silence, he heard it again, the deep, low vibration, now modulated like a breath. It was not the sound of machinery, nor of nature, but something between them, something orchestral and immense. He realized, with a kind of quiet awe, that it was in harmony with his own heartbeat. The realization did not frighten him. Instead, it filled him with a serene certainty, that the human body itself was but another instrument of this continuum. The pulse in his veins, the rotation of the lens, the rhythm of the tide, all were expressions of the same cosmic meter. The lighthouse was not merely a structure of stone and brass, it was an organ within a greater being, a node in the vast network of awareness that extended from the deepest trench to the farthest star. As dusk approached, he performed his routine in silence. But now each motion felt reverential. The trimming of the wick became an offering, the lighting of the flame an invocation. He wound the clockwork with care, feeling each click as a heartbeat beneath his hands. When the lamp began to turn, he stood beside it, eyes closed, breathing in rhythm with its pulse. The air seemed to vibrate softly through his ribs. He did not notice at first that the shadows in the room had begun to move independently of their sources. They swayed gently, like curtains caught in a faint breeze. When he opened his eyes, he saw them not as absences of light but as counterpoints, dark harmonics complementing the brightness. They too were part of the rhythm. And in their movement, he thought he discerned figures, past keepers perhaps, or the memories of them, drifting through the light in silent procession. Their presence was not ghostly but solemn, calm. Each one seemed absorbed in the same eternal duty, to keep watch. Thomas did not recoil. He simply lowered his head, acknowledging them. One of the figures paused, turned its dim outline toward him, and then, very slowly, raised its hand, mirroring the gesture he had seen days before in the reflection. The cycle had completed itself. The keeper and the light, the living and the remembered, were one continuum. He stood there long into the night, watching the beam revolve. The sea below responded with soft phosphorescence, pulsing in time. He realized then that he was witnessing not a haunting, but a form of communication, the rebirth of an ancient rite disguised as modern duty. The lighthouse was both temple and transmitter, and he, its last priest. The age of machines had not destroyed the sacred, it had simply given it a new language. And so, as midnight passed and the fog dissolved into starlight, Thomas whispered the only prayer he still knew, the keeper's oath, learned years ago and recited without thought at his first posting. But now, it carried weight. To keep the light, and in keeping, to be kept by it. The words felt vast, echoing through the iron and the sea alike. He did not yet know what would come next, only that the conversation between man and sea, between flame and memory, had begun again, as it always had, and as it always would. Morning rose with the kind of stillness that feels ceremonial, as though the world had paused its turning just long enough for some unrecorded rite to be completed in silence. Thomas awoke not to the cry of gulls or the moan of wind, but to the quiet hum of the lamp above, a sound so even, so alive, that it might have been his own pulse echoing through the tower's bones. The air was translucent, touched by gold and vapor. Every beam of light from the lantern chamber seemed to hang in place, moving with the grace of breath rather than the logic of mechanism. He rose slowly, his limbs heavy but not weary, and for the first time in months, he felt no divide between waking and dream. He climbed the spiral stair with ritual precision, his hands sliding along the worn brass rail. The stone steps were warm beneath his bare feet, as if they retained the heat of another presence. When he reached the lantern gallery, the sight that greeted him was almost unbearably serene. The sea lay stretched beneath him like a pane of glass, faintly luminous, mirroring the slow rotation of the lamp. The fog, which had so often concealed the horizon, now seemed to dissolve upward rather than outward, rising in ghostly tendrils that shimmered in the light sweep. It was as if the very air had become liquid, part of the same medium as the water below. He adjusted the lamp, as he always did, but the motions now carried a reverence that bordered on the sacred. He trimmed the wick, checked the oil, wound the clockwork, all the ordinary gestures that formed the fabric of a keeper's life. But in their repetition he sensed an unbroken lineage, a rhythm that stretched backward through time. Every click of the gear was an echo of another click, performed by another hand, perhaps a century ago. Each reflection in the lens was not only his face, but the accumulation of countless others who had stood where he stood, breathing the same salt air, watching the same indifferent sea. He thought then of those who had come before, the keepers whose notes he had found, the anonymous men whose words lingered in ink on the crumbling pages of the maintenance log. They had written of storms and repairs, but between their lines, he had glimpsed something else, a private vocabulary of awe and disquiet. They had sensed it too, that the lighthouse was more than structure, that its pulse was older than any man's. He imagined their lives unfolding in this same slow rhythm, days indistinguishable, marked only by the changing moods of light. Perhaps, he thought, they too had come to realize that the task of keeping the light was not simply to preserve visibility for passing ships, but to guard the boundary between the known and the infinite. The hum deepened. It no longer came from the lamp alone but from the walls, the floor, the air itself. He felt it in his ribs, in his fingertips, in the steady beat behind his eyes. The tower had become a tuning fork for something vast and unseen, a resonance that extended beyond matter. The light's rotation began to slow, imperceptibly at first, then with growing deliberation, until it no longer revolved at all but seemed to breathe in place, expanding and contracting like the lung of a sleeping giant. Thomas did not move. He stood at the center of the chamber, eyes open, and watched as the lens refracted the stillness into 1,000 trembling spectrums. For a moment, he saw within the glass what could only be described as memory. Shapes of men, indistinct and transparent, moved through the lens as if submerged within it, each performing the same motions, trimming the wick, checking the flame, winding the gear. They were not ghosts in the familiar sense, but repetitions of life itself, echoes replaying within the continuum of light. He saw the keeper of 1832, the one who had written of the singing lamp. He saw the unknown hand that had written "We remember you" in the logbook. He saw, dimly, even the outlines of those who would come after, their forms not yet fixed, their gestures unfinished. All of them were one act, one rhythm, one consciousness refracted through time. And then the light flared, gently, not with violence, but with the inevitability of sunrise. It filled the room until every surface vanished. He felt weightless, neither standing nor floating. The sound that followed was not a sound at all, but the perception of harmony without source. It was as if every note that had ever existed were playing at once, perfectly balanced, forming not a melody but a truth. And in that illumination, Thomas understood. He saw that the lighthouse was not merely an invention of man, nor an instrument of empire, nor even a monument to reason. It was an organism, a living aperture through which the universe regarded itself. Its stones were not inert but sentient in their own slow way, shaped by wind and salt into memory. The glass lens, so precise in its construction, was the eye of something greater than human design. And he, the keeper, was its heartbeat, its caretaker and participant. The continuum was not between man and sea, but between all things, the tide and the blood, the flame and the neuron, the mechanism and the soul. He thought then of how the physicians of this new century had begun to speak of the human body as machine, how they dissected flesh into systems, valves, and levers. They sought to map the living as they mapped the stars, believing that to measure was to know. But perhaps, he realized, the opposite was true. Perhaps the closer one measured the parts, the more one risked forgetting the rhythm that bound them. The modern world sought control, but the sea, always the sea, reminded him that control was an illusion sustained only by ignorance of the whole. To keep the light burning was not to dominate the dark, but to balance within it. The hum subsided. The radiance receded, leaving him once again in the gentle dimness of the morning. The lens resumed its rotation, as though nothing had occurred. Outside, the horizon gleamed with the pale shimmer of dawn. Thomas exhaled slowly, a sense of vast calm spreading through him. He returned to the logbook, his hand steady, and began to write. 24th of March, 1887. The sea has fallen into perfect accord with the lamp. I have learned that light does not banish darkness, it listens to it. The continuum remains unbroken. He paused, then added, I no longer feel that I am alone here. The words seemed unnecessary, redundant, for the air itself already contained their truth. He closed the book and sat by the narrow window overlooking the sea. Below, the tide moved with slow deliberation, its motion as sure as the breath of a sleeping creature. The phosphorescence of the previous night still shimmered faintly beneath the surface, alive with a secret light of its own. He felt no need to question it anymore. The mystery no longer demanded explanation, it invited participation. That afternoon, he descended to the base of the tower, where the rock met the surf. The air was damp, filled with the scent of kelp and iron. He knelt and placed his hand against the stone. The hum was faint but present, a pulse traveling upward through the foundation. He thought of all the lighthouses scattered along the coasts of the world, each one built upon rock, each one singing its quiet song into the sea. Perhaps they were connected, he mused, not by telegraph or chart, but by resonance. Perhaps every tower, every keeper, every flame was part of a single network of remembrance stretching across oceans and centuries. He looked out at the water, and for a moment, he thought he saw it again, the faint figure standing where the tide met the fog. It was not menacing. It was familiar. It raised its hand, slowly, as though in benediction. Thomas did not move, nor did he wave. He simply bowed his head, understanding now that the gesture was not farewell, but recognition. The light had acknowledged itself. As evening approached, he returned to the gallery and lit the lamp once more. The mechanism turned flawlessly. The beam swept the sea with quiet grace, reaching far into the encroaching dark. He watched it for hours, his thoughts suspended, his breathing calm. And as the stars began to emerge above the horizon, he sensed, no, he knew, that he was not merely observing the world. He was participating in its ongoing act of creation. The continuum was not theory. It was practice. Each moment of maintenance, each careful winding of the clockwork, each patient observation of tide and flame, these were the gestures by which the ancient ritual endured, disguised as duty. The lighthouse was both machine and altar, and the keeper its priest, bound not by faith, but by rhythm. Long after midnight, Thomas extinguished the lamp. The darkness folded in gently, not as absence, but as completion. He sat there in the silence, the afterglow of the wick fading to ember. The hum persisted faintly in the stones, in his chest, in the sea. He smiled, his eyes half closed. The line between his life and the light had vanished completely. He was keeper and kept, observer and observed. Outside, the horizon dissolved once more into mist. The sea breathed. And somewhere within that endless, shimmering field of darkness and light, the world continued to remember itself, through the pulse of the ocean, through the flame of the lamp, through the steady heart of a man who had at last learned that routine was never ordinary, but the quiet language of eternity. The wind changed in the night. It arrived without warning, soft, unhurried, and strangely warm for that late in the season. Thomas awoke to it brushing against the panes, stirring the edges of his logbook on the table. The air smelled of salt and rain and iron, the scent of everything that endures. He rose slowly, aware that the tower felt different, as though the day itself had not yet decided to begin. There was no clear boundary between waking and sleeping anymore. He had lived too long in the rhythm of the lamp, and its steady pulse had rewritten his sense of time. He dressed in silence, each motion deliberate, unbroken by thought. The room glowed faintly with the reflection of the sea below, though no sun yet rose above the horizon. It was a light without source, one that seemed to emerge from the air itself, pale and ghostly, like a memory of daylight rather than the thing itself. He felt no fear, only a calm awareness that this was how the world spoke when one learned to listen long enough. He climbed the stair once more. Each step echoed like a heartbeat. The walls seemed to breathe with him, stone inhaling, exhaling, a communion older than language. He remembered the day he first arrived, when he had thought of the lighthouse as a structure of labor and solitude, a fortress against the elements. How naive that vision seemed now. He understood that he had not been sent here to keep the light burning, but to be kept by it. He was no longer the master of the flame, he was its continuation. At the top, the gallery was bathed in that soft, sourceless glow. The lamp had extinguished itself some time before dawn, yet the room was not dark. The glass lens stood still, its massive eye reflecting a slow shimmer that was not light but awareness. He approached, feeling the hum rise through the floorboards, gentle but insistent, like a pulse beneath the skin of the earth. He placed his hand upon the brass frame. It was warm, not the warmth of flame, but of living presence. Beneath his palm, he could feel it breathing. The hum deepened, and for an instant, he thought he heard something within it, voices, perhaps, faint and overlapping, like whispers carried through water. They were not words, not in any tongue he knew, but tones, harmonics. The sound of the sea, the wind through the glass, and something else, the echo of all who had stood here before him, all who would stand hereafter. He closed his eyes. The whispers grew clearer, not louder, but more distinct. He could hear them arranging themselves into rhythm, into meaning that bypassed thought. It was the voice of the lighthouse itself, not speaking to him, but through him, as though he were only the latest instrument in a symphony that had never ceased playing. We do not end, Thomas. He did not know if the words were spoken aloud, or if his mind had simply translated the vibration into understanding. We are the continuation. You have kept us alive. He wanted to respond, to ask what we meant, whether it referred to the keepers, the light, the sea, but the question dissolved before it reached his tongue. He understood that such distinctions no longer applied. We was everything, the flame, the lens, the tide, the breath that filled his lungs. All were part of the same rhythm, repeating across centuries, disguising itself in human purpose and mechanical precision. He opened his eyes, and the world had changed. The sea was motionless, an unbroken mirror stretching to the edge of perception. The horizon no longer separated water from sky, both had merged into a single field of pale luminescence. The air shimmered with faint lines of light, currents of energy that drifted upward like the afterimage of heat. Time had thinned. The lighthouse no longer stood apart from its surroundings, it floated within them, suspended between real and remembered. Thomas stepped closer to the glass, and in its reflection, he did not see himself. He saw 1,000 other faces layered one upon another, each a variation of the same gaze, men and women, some old, some young, all looking outward toward the sea. Their eyes shared the same calm knowing. Among them, he glimpsed the outline of the first keeper, the one whose handwriting had filled the oldest pages of the log, and beside him, the faint image of a woman he did not recognize, her hand steady upon the lamp. They were all there, united by the rhythm of their service, the sacred monotony that had carried through the ages. The light within the lens began to pulse again, but this time it was slower, heavier, as if breathing in a great exhaustion. Each pulse illuminated the gallery for an instant, then faded into shadow. Thomas felt his heartbeat aligning with it, each contraction of his heart matching the swell of the radiance. With every pulse, a fragment of memory drifted across his vision, fog rolling in from the north, the distant toll of a ship's bell, the scent of oil and salt, the warmth of another's hand that might never have existed. The hum rose once more, and he understood that it was time. He took the key from around his neck, the same key that had opened every door of the tower, from the oil room to the lantern gallery. Its surface had worn smooth over years of handling. He turned it slowly in his fingers, feeling its weight, its permanence. It had never occurred to him to wonder what it unlocked beyond the doors of the lighthouse. But now, standing within this strange convergence of worlds, he realized that the key had never been meant for locks at all. It was a symbol, a token of participation in the continuum. He placed it upon the table beside the logbook, where its small metallic gleam caught the last of the light. He opened the log to a blank page. The hum filled the room like the sound of deep water. He dipped his pen in ink, though the bottle was nearly empty. The words came without effort, his hand moving as if guided by something outside of himself. End of cycle. The light continues. He stopped. Beneath those words, he wrote a line he did not remember thinking. I am awake inside the dream that keeps the sea. He set the pen down and closed the book. Outside, the first true sunlight of dawn was rising, but it seemed paler than before, as though filtered through something unseen. The world itself appeared to be holding its breath. The sea did not move. The air was perfectly still. Even the gulls had fallen silent. He felt a profound stillness settle within him, not peace, exactly, but the cessation of every boundary that had once defined him. He no longer felt hunger, or weariness, or solitude. There was only the pulse of the light, steady and unbroken. He walked down the stair one final time. Each step echoed less distinctly, as though the stone beneath him were softening, dissolving into memory. The walls that had once enclosed him now seemed transparent, the light passing through them like water. When he reached the base of the tower, he stepped outside into a dawn that felt neither new nor old. The horizon shimmered, and the line between earth and sea was gone. He stood on the rocks, watching the water merge with the sky. For a moment, he thought he saw figures moving across the surface, shadows walking where no man could walk. They were not approaching, nor receding. They were simply there, existing as reflections of something unseen. He raised his hand in silent acknowledgement. The figures did not answer, but the light behind them brightened, as though smiling. The hum reached its highest pitch, then softened into something almost imperceptible, a vibration felt rather than heard, the final chord of a song that had no beginning. And then, the light swept once more across the horizon. It turned, slow and deliberate, illuminating the sea with its calm gaze. From miles away, a passing ship would have seen it and marked it on their charts, unaware that anything had changed. To them, the lighthouse was what it had always been, a reliable instrument of guidance, its keeper silent and steadfast. They would never know that the keeper had dissolved into the rhythm of the lamp, that he had become part of the very light he tended. Days would pass. The next relief ship would come. The sailors would find the tower immaculate, the lamp trimmed, the logbook closed upon its final entry. They would search for the keeper, calling his name through empty rooms that still hummed faintly with the echo of his heartbeat. They would report his disappearance as a mystery, though not an uncommon one. The sea, after all, had taken many men in stranger ways. But those who lingered long enough, those who stood by the glass lens at night and listened, would sometimes swear that they heard something within the walls, a faint whispering, like breath caught in the gears. Some would say it was only the sound of the mechanism, or the echo of wind through the stairwell. Others would not speak of it at all. Yet every one of them, sooner or later, would feel the same thing, a subtle warmth in the air, as though someone still kept watch. And perhaps, in some way, someone always did. Because the light never stopped. Its beam turned without falter, sweeping the dark with its slow, eternal rhythm. It remembered what the keeper had learned, that the world was not divided between day and night, life and death, memory and forgetting. Everything was connected by the same luminous thread, drawn through centuries like a lantern's wick. To keep the light was to keep the world dreaming. The sea breathed. The wind shifted. The light turned again. And in that vast, serene rhythm, the boundary between the human and the eternal vanished completely. The lighthouse dreamed on, and within its dreaming heart, the keeper still walked, his steps soundless, his eyes reflecting the calm of an infinite horizon, his soul bound forever to the light that remembers itself. The day began again. The sea whispered against the stones. Far below the surface, in the quiet corridors of the deep, the same pulse moved outward, carrying with it the memory of light. And somewhere, beyond the reach of sight or reason, the continuum endured, unchanging, unbroken, and eternally awake.